Okay. So the root of the word tzniut, as we see here, it's very rare in the Tanakh, and it's actually not. It's connected. We're going to see the sources soon, but the word when we talk about modesty in English, I think it's similar. What I was trying to say with when the sound was bad. When we talk about modesty, modesty is not how we dress. Modesty is how we act. It can be a way of living. You can live in a modest apartment, you can live in a modest home. And we realize that within the word modesty itself, we have a lot of subjective questions, objective, and also questions of relativity, because one can live in a modest way. And for someone else, that can be extravagant, and vice versa. It has to do with society, with social issues, and also, I would say, more than anything else, has to do with the personal attitude that a person has to how they're living their life, how they are acting, how they are living. And within that, we can also understand the question of how I dress in connection to all of that. But the root word, tzadik nun ayin, is connected to the word discreet, to be hidden, to be humble. Um, and this is the source that we will soon see. But when I was discussing this with my wife, with Carmel yesterday, so she said, well, you have the first story of mankind in the Torah, which is connected to this subject. And it's very interesting as such that the Torah feels that this is important enough that this is how we start as human beings. And we see in the story in Bereshit, the beginning is that the Torah mentions that Adam and Eve were naked. והיו שניהם ערומים, האדם ואשתו, ולא התבוששו. This also brings forward an interesting question, because who are they naked for? Are they naked for, are you naked in front of your cat, for example? Are you naked in front of the lion, in front of the elephant? Is it only between human beings that one is naked? What if one is alone? Is that considered to be naked if one is alone, right? So the Torah uses the term naked, one of the first terms that is connected to the action of humankind in this world. It's a status in which it says that they were both naked. And you see that in the translation already, a little translation is problematic. And the translation here of Sefaria, correctly so, goes into an explanation and explains that arumim plays on the word arum, shrewd, because we're going to see the same exact word used in the beginning of the next chapter in terms of the snake, in which it says that the snake was arum. So the same, and in that case, the snake is not naked, right? The snake is being shrewd. So the translation says, wait, the arum has to do with missing something. So if you're not if you're not proper, if you're hiding something from someone else, then that could also be from the same source of arum. And but the literal translation is that Adam and his wife were naked, and they were not. They felt no shame. In other words, that also brings forward reflections of what do clothes cover up, right? And are clothes covering up something so that the hidden is something good? Because usually when we cover something up, it's something that we feel is bad. And it brings forward the question, I think, which is very relevant in society. And I'm just throwing out some reflections um, eh, just to start off the conversation. But I remember there was a TED talk by the founder of Google a few years ago that I saw, in which they were talking about privacy and the Google privacy, and the fact that basically when you sign on, and today it's everything that is connected to Microsoft, to Google, to all of these programs. Whenever you install any app, then you just sign on. Do you agree? And what we're agreeing on many times is to share a lot of information with these companies. So I remember a sentence in this TED show in which he said, um, I think it was the Google founder, if I'm not mistaken. he said, well, we all know that anything private is bad, right? We all know that if you're hiding something, then there's a reason that you're hiding it. And the reason I recall this is because it's a whole concept of Western society in which we can connect it to Christianity and Christian theology if we want to take it in that direction. But we don't have time for a full seminar on this. But basically, it brings forward the question: is what is clothing or what is cover up? And some of the most beautiful things happen in private. What is intimate is beautiful. It's not hidden in a bad way, it's hidden in a beautiful way. You don't share intimate things with other people because it's beautiful to have a good secret, a beautiful secret. We have a kids children's book in our library which talks about good secrets and bad secrets for in terms of education for children. What is a good secret and what is a bad one? So the Talmud, I didn't bring this source, but the Talmud says that it's very interesting to note that the word for clothing is beged, bet gimel dalet, right? Bet gimel dalet are the third, right? Is that you have aleph, bet gimel and dalet. Beged is clothing. So the Talmud says that the word for beged is the same word as trader. So it connects to this idea a boged is someone who is a traitor. So um, or a liar, or someone who is hiding something from you. So it's very interesting. What is the connection of clothing and how do we perceive clothing? But I'm just throwing this out at you. We're not going to go through all of this. I hope it makes sense. Just what like these notions or these ideas. So if we go forward in the sources, so in the next chapter it says, "Then vatipakachna einei shnehem veyidu ke'erumim hem." In other, after they had sinned, then God comes to them, and their eyes were open, and they perceived that they were naked. In other words, the fact that they had sinned it now brings forward, I would say, they have lost some of this childish naivety, and we see this from a child who matures also sexually. That you have what is naked for a child should hopefully be something which is innocent, right? Which is open, which is not in any way, unfortunately, today could be, we know how much this can be abused, but you go through a sense of maturity in which what was naked, innocent, naive, and pure then becomes something else, right? And you see that the eyes of both of them were opened and they perceived that they were naked, and then they got their first um, clothing. So you see that the clothing has to do with, one can say, a maturity, but also has to do with sin. The fact that they sinned also brought forward this acknowledgement that and the need for clothing. So within this, we can also ask many questions. In other words, if we did not sin, if one just grows up naturally, or what is within that problematic and what is not. So this is just starting off the discussion regarding nakedness. But I'm going to go forward here, and um, the source, if we look at this idea further of something which is the same term that is used for arum, something which is naked, is used as a commandment in terms of how we shall act. And the passage in Dvarim, in Deuteronomy 23, says, "Since the Hashem, your God, moves about in your camp to protect and to deliver your enemies to you, let your be holy. Let him not find any unseemly among you, and turn away from you." So we have this notion of the camp being holy, and Vaya Machanecha Kadosh, that your camp shall be, and within that we have a, and within that it says the same word, Lo Yireh Becha Irvat Davar. Let him not find anything unseemly, or the same, it's the same root word as nakedness. So we have this general notion, which is also translated in halachic terms, that anything which brings forward nakedness, in the sense in which it is unseemly. I think it's in the translation is okay. Um, Makes your entire camp to be unholy. So, in other words, when we talk about this idea, it's a very, very broad term because what does unseemly mean? What does it mean to be naked? So it can be in many ways. It can be how we act towards one another. It can be act in terms of hiding, not being true to each other, and definitely in the way that we can also act improperly toward one another, including sexuality as well. That within that, you have something which is called holiness. And we know, for example, when we walk into a place of holiness, like the synagogue, there's something in which a way that we act, which is differently. You're acting out of respect, and you don't just act in the same way. So if you know that Hashem is walking amongst us, in other words, that we are living with Hashem, we're living the way of Hashem in our lives, then that should bring something forward in the way that we speak, in the way that we act, 24/7, that is kadosh, that is holy. And therefore, anything which is, um, you can say it even within jokes, the way that what do we joke about, or do we use, you know, black humor? Do we use sexuality? Do we use just even cursing? I would say is a sense of ervat davar, anything that is not is that is unholy in that sense. And when we talk about the opposite, then contrast to the world that we live in which privacy is something maybe that is considered, you're hiding something um, in a bad way. If we look at the pasuk in Proverbs, King Solomon says, right, "Kvod Elohim haster davar, ukvod melachim chakor davar." It is the glory of God to conceal a matter. In other words, if we're talking about being godly, then some things don't have to be shared. And not because they're bad, but because they're intimate, because they are honorable, because sometimes you do something and it's better not to share it. We know that, when you're doing a mitzvah, for example, you're doing something which is good, doesn't have to be shared with everyone. If you're doing tzedakah, right? If you're giving charity. So the Maimonides says that the highest level of charity is actually the charity that that one gives without it being known, because there's something beautiful about intimacy, about hiding, about doing something when it's not has no social context. Then there's no chance that it's gonna lose the integrity. So kvod Elohim aster davar, it is the glory of God to conceal a matter. And I think that in the many of us can feel that, but the world that we live in is not one of such concealing, in which you're concealing beautiful things and things of intimacy. And then we have the opposite, in which you say, "Oh well, I'm going to show everything to everyone." So after that introduction, we get to the main um, source of the word where tzniut comes from, and it comes from the prophet Micha. It's a very small, right, prophet. You can and beautiful. You can look it up in the Tanakh. And the Talmud teaches us that that Micha is actually telling us the foundations of the world. And he says that the entire Judaism, or even all of humanity, stands on three things. And what are these three things? He has told you what is good, right? Hashem has told you what is good. And what does Hashem require of you? So basically, if you have to say, okay, what is it all about, right? So we've spoken before about loving your neighbor, like we learned from Hillel, um, and Rabbi Akiva, and when we were learning Pirkei Avot in the Beit Midrash. But Micha puts it, he says it's on basically all of being a good person relies on three things: to do justice, to love goodness, and to walk modestly with your God. So you see that according to Micha, we know that this idea of justice and goodness we see throughout the Torah. It comes all and throughout the prophets. That basically this balance between justice and goodness and truth, all of that is very. We have multiple examples. But what is unique here is that Micha uses the word "v'hatznea lechet im Elohecha," to walk modestly with your God. So you notice that it doesn't say walk modestly with people, doesn't say live modestly, doesn't say act modestly. Walk modestly with your God. And in my opinion, it connects back to what we saw before, that how we're walking modestly with Hashem, with knowing that Hashem is with us every moment of our lives, changes the way that we act and changes our the way that we act wherever we are, whether we're alone or whether in a social situation. It changes how and what we are buying and for what reason. And we know on the opposite that it's not a bad thing to be to right to because of the holiness we want things to be beautiful. We want our Shabbat table to be beautiful. We want the way, right, we want to wear special clothing for Shabbat. It doesn't mean that that is immodest, but when you're doing something for a higher value, when you're doing something out of the fact that I'm doing this in order to beautify holiness, then that is modest. Whereas if you're doing it in a sense of I want everyone to see how beautiful I am dressed, it's really up to you. You're the only one, I would say, that knows the difference, that very right fine difference between the two of those. To walk modestly can only be with your God, can only be something that you know with Hashem. And the second instance, if we go down one more, the second instance of the source word of tzniut is in Proverbs, where he says, "When arrogance appears, disgrace follows, but wisdom is with those who are unassuming." And the word unassuming is using the same word of tznuim. Wisdom is with those who are tzanua, those who are modest. So you see that the opposite of arrogance is to be tzanua, or to be modest. Um, if we scroll down, I want to get to the sources. So if we scroll down a bit more, so um, Sefer Mitzvot. No, go back up a bit. Sorry, where we were, Sophie. Yeah. Okay. So being modest, and this is Sefer Mitzvot Katan. So now we're already talking about Sefer Mitzvot, the commandments themselves. So what does it mean? What is the commandment to be modest? So Sefer Mitzvot says as follows: being modest, as it is written, and your camp shall be holy, and it is written, and walking modestly with your God. These are the passages that we saw above. The sages said that no one is modest but he who is modest in the bathroom. In other words, if there's one place that hopefully no one can be watching us, you never know in these days who has placed a hidden camera where, right? And there's almost nowhere. I think part of what something that has changed even in the last few years is this understanding that there's nowhere that is not that anywhere where you are can be covered by a camera. This I think changes a lot of in our perception of walking in the street. Even it's not in my mind all of the time, but the fact that even subconsciously, you're driving on the road. There's a camera that's following you. Many people even have a camera, right? A dash cam on their car, and you see that what is hidden is really changed a lot. But there's one place where hopefully, right, there's no camera. We have these crazy stories as well, in which right people are placing cameras um, and abusing the modesty of a person, right? Eh, but in a normal sense, the Talmud says that where can one um, really have the best sense of whether he or she is a modest person is in the bathroom, because it's how we act. Do we act animalistic or do we act humane? And these are very fine and delicate things of how we are acting that differentiates us in the modesty that we have between, I would say, the nishama that we have and the animal side of us that we have. Even though the sages also note, for example, that we all know that cats, for example, are modest in this way as well, that they naturally are modest in covering up um, their feces, but in that sense, um, going to the bathroom is right where you can check is a person modest. First of all, because you're with God there, in a in the sense that there's no one else. So and also, um, right, it's not social. So the Talmud is teaching us that this is where one can actually check his or her modesty. So I'm continuing here. One must also be modest in marital relations. Also, in every matter, one must act with modesty and not with pritzut. Pritzut can mean breaching standards, but also with arrogance, with breaking down the social norms that we live in, and the world that we live in is constantly trying to break any standards that we have, and saying, well, these standards, we're going to break them. And what was the norm of modesty 30 years ago, and what was considered unacceptable today is changing a lot. So what is this? What does it mean to breach standards? And what are those standards is a question in and of itself. But this also includes, I'm continuing in the source, this includes you shall cover your excrement, which is adjacent to it in the text. So too, we must perform modestly at the time of Torah and Tefillah, and one must distance himself from excrement and from urine. So, in other words, when you're praying, obviously you're not allowed to pray anywhere where um, is dirty in any sense, and that connects also to this to modesty. But going back to what we saw before, even in marital relations, we also have a question of what is modest and what is not, and and it has to do with the intimate relations between the couple and how they are relating to each other. I would say brings forward a sense of modesty or immodesty. So when we say what is immodest in that sense, what is not considered modest could be considered animalistic. And again, as in the bathroom, it's very subjective. And even though there are rules of halakha relating to this, but what I keep going back to the sense of it being very, very connected to where a person is. Let's go down to the next source. Rabbanit Michal Tukachinsky she's a very famous Rabbanit, right? Today, could anyone could anyone read this out for us? Sophie, you're already unmuted. Maybe you can read it first.
Sure. The connection between the two verses, between the ethical call of the prophet and the practical instruction of the Torah, shapes Tzeniut as a value of broad scope that also finds practical expression in concrete context. Just as the experience of the presence of God accompanies a person in all his ways, so to the matter of Tzeniut expands to a range of areas and to different levels of obligation. For this reason, the laws of Tzeniut are not concentrated under the heading, and one cannot find them organized in a single tractate or chapter of the halakhic literature.
So I want to tell you that I was quite upset in preparing this shiur, because when I looked up of some of the halachic books that are more modern and contemporary, and looked up Hilchot Tzniut, So almost immediately they jumped to the question of clothing, of dress, and within that to specifically to women's dress. And within that, the reason that I resonated very much with what the Rabbanit Michalti Kuczynski is saying here is that this is broad. Like we saw in the Psukim, there's one application that many times we get focused or over focused on is how are we dressing? Because that is, first of all, the most external. And maybe it's also something that we can notice quite easily in terms of um, eh, interaction between social interaction between us. But we know very well that that there's very different norms in different societies, and what would be considered pritzut in one society, right? What one considered a breach in one society would be very accepted um, in another society. If we take the extreme example of Iran and the hijab, for example, so I saw on the news last night that there was a woman, it's not the first time, who received 72 lashes, um, which is, um, and done in a terrible fashion, 72 lashes for uncovering her hair in public. So they would consider that a breach. But do we consider that a breach, or do we consider that a breach of human rights? So what is considered, what is and what is not considered a breach is a big question. The Rabbanit here takes it back to an all-encompassing question of how does one live, and therefore tzniut can have to do with like we were saying, how one is living, how one is acting, to sexual relations, to the bathroom, to how one is acting as a soldier. Um, and I actually we had a just an interesting on this very note. We had just this Shabbat. We had kiddush for one of my friends who's for his 40th birthday. And until the last minute, we didn't know if we were going to be able to have this birthday because he was in Gaza, and he's in a very elite unit there. And he managed to get out, and many were, the women said that they were praying actually that he get out just for him and for his family also, that he be able to celebrate his birthday in a normal sense. And at this kiddush, he actually brought up the fact, he says, reaching this age of 40, so what does it mean to me to live a normal life when nothing is normal anymore? And he talked about a breach of norms in Gaza of the soldiers, in which he says, how do you know if you know that a soldier has just joined, that he hasn't been in Gaza, that he came from the outside, if he asks you where the garbage bin is? Because we don't have any garbage bins. You finish your lunch, if you happen to have any, you don't have a choice of what you're eating for the last 3 months. And you just receive whatever food they manage to get to you under fire, but immediately you throw it out the window. There's no, or leave it where it is. There's no garbage can. So there's no bathrooms. There's no running water. So when we talk about modesty and the norms and social norms, and many times we know that this is turns soldiers into, we hear terrible things in cases of war, because you lose touch with what is modest, what is keeping me modest in this sense. So it was very special for me to hear this from Amitai, my friend, and it's crazy because now he's back. He's back where he was, and he got out for Shabbat, and he's back there in this crazy war. But I think it was very special to hear for him that he just wanted normalcy. He wanted to be back to the bathroom. He wanted to be back to having a garbage bin to throw out your waste. And just as I think it's a good example. So let's, if we follow it, if we scroll down a bit more, Sophie. Yeah. So we have positive examples of a of what it's tzniut, because I think we've been reflecting on a lot on the negative or what is not tzanua. So um, I brought here a midrash that just if we recall the story of Ruth, the very special scroll of Ruth of Megillah that we read on Shavuot, Ruth who is a convert, right? So the story of Ruth, just to remind us, is um, when in the middle of the whole story. So they come back from Moab, and she's going out. Ruth is sent out by her mother-in-law to collect the leftovers in the fields because they have nothing to eat. And then Boaz, who is the lord of the lands, you can say, right, the very rich man, he notices her. And then within that story, we also have a question, right? We have a very intimate moment in which she goes into the barn in the middle of the night, and he's very frightened by this. And instead of taking advantage of her, he says, "We must do this properly," because she wants him to redeem her. So you can look into the story, and if you're not familiar with it. But within this, the Midrash on Ruth says as follows: Since Boaz saw that she was pleasant, this is about Ruth, and her deeds were beautiful, he began to inquire about her. In other words, he knows especially the low class and how they are used to acting. And he's letting these people into his fields as a matter of charity and allowing them um, in to collect, what is left over, the leftovers that are left behind in the fields. And he notices, because he notices he's used to the low class and the fact that they're more, I would say, in a survival mode in which modesty is not what is coming through. And suddenly he sees a young woman who comes in, and just everything about her is pleasant and her deeds were beautiful. He began to inquire about her. All the women bend and gather barley, but this one sits and gathers. In other words, there's something in the gesture of even stepping down towards um, the barley, which can be animalistic, can be a mode of survival, whereas she brings it up to her. That's my own understanding of this. You can also perhaps understand it as being um, a blunt or even sexual bending over in a sense. But in whatever way we see this, she's sitting down and bringing and in a beautiful way, gathering up to her. It requires more, but she's gathering up the barley to her. All the women lift up their clothes to ease gathering, but this one lowers her clothes. All the women flirt with the harvesters, but this one keeps herself modest. So there's something about her that even the master, who has all of these slaves or low class people running around and poor people, um, something about her just shines, something about her that is pleasant, and the way that she acts is an example of her inner shining, you can say, the way that she is, even the way that she's walking, the way that she's and so you see that the actions that she is taking is a result of the person that she is, and not vice versa. So um, within that, you can see that this is a positive example that we have, in which you see that the way that if one is a modest person and coming from a place of humbleness, then that comes through in the way that you act, even in the subconscious. I don't think that Ruth, in my opinion, sat there and said, according to this and this, I should do this or that, but rather in the way that she was coming from a place of modesty, this was what came forward, even in this situation in which she maybe have not even noticed it, but someone else did. Um, and if we scroll down to the next source, um, so it says the Meiri on Shabbat. Again, when the Talmud in Shabbat mentions and talks about tzniut, so he picks up on this and he says, even though tzniut is praiseworthy for everyone, for women it is nevertheless especially praiseworthy. So in a positive way, I think following up on the example of Ruth, you can see women, because there's so much a negative um, focus in terms of sexuality and in terms of immodesty and in terms of that is focused a lot on women in the world that we live in. So the opposite can also be true, that tzniut is obviously something that is relevant equally for men and for women. And everything that we have seen so far has not spoken about women. And even the first psukim in Genesis in Bereshit talked about Adam v'Chava and how they related to each other and their nakedness. However, there's something especially eh, that comes through the women, even more so that is than men, in which he's saying it is more praiseworthy, right, for women because they have the beauty of being able to shine and bring this forward of what modesty is really about. Something in the subconscious, something in the beauty that we saw in Ruth, in which maybe it becomes more external in terms of men. I know it's stereotyping, but I'm following the Meiri here, saying that the women have the possibility to shine this inner tzniut even more so than men do. And the final source that we're going to see today, and I'm sorry, I'm going to extend our time a bit today because of all of the technical issues that we had. If anyone has to leave, it's okay. But this is recorded anyway. So the last source that we see is one which is quoted many times. Um, my I was just at a bat last week for my brother who is um, one can, I don't know the spectrum, one can say ultra orthodox Haredi in a sense, and it was very interesting to be at a bat mitzvah to hear a bat mitzvah girl in that world speak about what does it mean for her to become her womanhood. And she quoted this pasuk, which is Kol kvoda bat melech pnima mimishbetzot zahav levusha. All the honor of a king's daughter is within. Her clothing is of wrought gold. So many times, actually, when this is quoted, the second part is not is forgotten. But this pasuk from Tehillim is saying that the true respect and the true honor comes from within and not from the external. But the continuation talks about the clothing. In other words, that there is something about, like we are saying, when you're dressing for Shabbat, you want to dress beautifully. When you go to a beautiful occasion, you should dress no less beautiful for the synagogue than, if we're going to use a cultural example, than when one goes to the opera or one goes to the movies. Right, you get dressed up because it's an occasion. So in that sense, when you're walking out, in the way that we walk, in the way that we addressed, should be something which is honorable. We have halachot that talks about a rabbi, for example. There's specific halachot that you cannot wear torn clothing because you are representing the Torah, and if the way that you are dressed is representing Hashem, so the kavod comes from within. The kavod should not be something that comes from without. And I think it's important point that when we talk about what is respectable and where respect, it should not come from my social interactions. It should come from within. However, the way that I dress, once I have that, then I can dress beautifully and modestly. Whereas if the opposite is true, if what is making me feel respected is the external, then in itself I will not be able to reach a modesty. Okay, we can stop sharing, Sophie. We can stop sharing now. I want to be able to see everyone. So yeah, you can turn your video on because it was my computer. It wasn't any of you. Um, so we've gone through a number of sources, a journey on sources on the notion of tzniut. I hope we have a broader understanding in terms of how we see this within Judaism. But then within that, we come back to the first picture that I showed you at the beginning, right? The picture in which, right, what is the proper code of dress? And again, I want to, before we go forward, I want to I'll share with you that we had an interesting conversation on this in the yishuv, in the community that I live. We live in a mixed village. Mixed can mean many things, but it has both men and women and children and dogs and cats, so it's very mixed. But it also has, it was said as a community of religious and non-religious, um, which brings forward, I think, many questions because we have questions in the school. And one of the biggest things is that we live at the edge of the Judean desert. So we have a community pool. So how do you deal with a community pool with people with very mixed notions of what is modesty, for example, and also different criteria of what is and what is not? And what is clear is that a setting of mixed swimming is not acceptable for even if everyone were to be dressed modestly, let's say in full swim gear, that's still the setting itself would not be considered acceptable. But so when they created this pool, there was a lot of community discussion because and one of the things that I brought forward strongly, and others as well, is that this is a community pool. So just to have separate hours in which you have, okay, well, the non-religious will have all of their hours on Shabbat, and then the religious will have their hours in the morning, and non-religious can have the mixed in the afternoon. But then is there a possibility to actually meet somewhere in the middle? And it was a fantastic conversation. And within that, we set community guidelines in which we said we're going to have something called family hour, in which the kids can go together in the pool, and the adults can sit on the grass, right, and chat and have community time. But if any of the adults want to go into the pool during this hour, then in order to be sensitive to everyone, then you have to be, as soon as you come out of the pool, you have to put you have to be dressed, put on shirt, um, and this was brought forward as it's very interesting because these discussions, you make assumptions sometimes about, oh, well, they're secular, so they for no, you have the same discussions of what is modest and what is not between parents and their teenage kids wherever they are, right, and wherever they're growing up. It's not something that is, oh, well, the religious see it this way, and you have people who see different things. So this was happily accepted by everyone. But can you guess who was following the rule? Only the women, right? So the women were following the rule. And as soon as they came out, they were getting dressed and then coming to the grass area where we can be together. And the men were not. And then some people complained actually to me. And they said, why is this about women? This is about everyone feeling comfortable with each other when we're sitting on the grass. And I wrote a letter to the community, and then the community, I think they have good solutions. So they went and they bought um, like 100 shirts, and then the lifesavers were handing them out mostly to the men, right? In when they got out, and being strict about the rules, saying these are the rules of that we have set as community rules. It's not a religious rule, and I think it was very strong that we came. I said this is not about religious and not religious. This is about a community rule and respect and modesty that we have to all follow. That being said, so I think at least in my opinion, it's a positive example um, of trying to understand and also being sensitive to one another. Um, but we know that in the world that we live, And now after all of this introduction, I am gonna step over into the world of halakha guidelines, but it's only after I have done so for 40 minutes that I'm gonna actually step into the world of halakha. So within we unfortunately, I would say that there are more guidelines halachically towards women than there are towards men. And I think there's a huge lacking of this and a lacking of a understanding, or even I would say yes and no, because within the men's world there are social standards that would be set, because the world is quite segregated. One would never walk in with short pants to a yeshiva, or to a synagogue. And there are halachot about that. There are halachot about covering one's hand, for example, completely, and one's legs completely when you're praying, because it's a time of utter respect that is not, you're not on vacation. So there are specific halachot, and these are regarding men as well. And there are even some, I would say, more um, and there are some synagogues that I've seen, mostly Sfaradi, not Ashkenaz, in which you walk in and at least the cantor has to be wearing, the Chazan has to be wearing long clothing. And think about Israel, when the norm could be very well that people are walking around with with shirts and shorts. You walk into the prayer, that's not acceptable. There are others that will just go by social standard and say, well, that's how we dress and that is okay. So those, and but though these halachot, I would say, focused on prayer, like we saw in the sources as well. What is lacking is a general understanding what happens within a mixed setting. Because what happens if you're at the Dead Sea, like the picture that I showed you? Is it considered, or is it not considered, modest or immodest for a man to take off, to go in with just a bathing suit to within such a setting? Let's say you're talking about. I think that there's a lack of definition halachically, and I would say I say lack because it's wrongfully so, because there should be, if you're setting criteria for women, you should be setting criteria for men as well. All of that being said, like I told you before, I was frustrated when I was looking at the halachot, that a lot of it is over focused or becomes a focused on women. All that being said, we know um, that when we are approaching the question of modesty and immodesty and tzniut and all of that, the Talmud itself discusses specific questions of immodesty in the way that women dress more so than men. So, after all being said, that is where there is a focus. And within that, there are specific criteria that are set halachically. And I think there's a difference of opinion, which goes back to all the way back to the Rishonim, to the poskim, the original poskim of halacha, all the way back, hundreds of years ago, if not more. And within that, there's I think it's easier for some to set very clear guidelines of what is and what is not accepted according to halakha. So you will see such guidelines today, such as very clear within the religious world, for example, a woman should be wearing a dress, pants are not acceptable, the dress should be below the knee, so that you're not entering into any questions of anything which is, again, after all we said, the word that will be used is immodesty. So that is a very simple way, and I would say, in my opinion, it's a bit too simple, because you might lose out on the whole idea of what tzniut is if you're setting guidelines as such. If no one is asking questions, that is the norm, okay. But what if someone is asking questions of, is this or this is not tsanua? I have a teenage daughter, right, who drives her crazy, because you go through and you have people who are traumatized, because when this becomes the religious focus or over focus of what are you wearing today, and that is what will, you'll be sent home if you're not wearing this or that, because we are a religious high school, then what is is that the right thing to do? And these are questions of education, right? Of trying, what are the norms that we set about everything? Um, I remember I was on a bus, and the bus stopped, and it was in Tel Aviv actually, and the bus stopped and picked up some teenagers who were coming off the beach, and the bus driver said to them, "You're not getting on my bus that way." Again, it was not religious. This is not something you can't. It's not the beach here, but right. So what is and what is not is very difficult. But when we talk about, if we talk very specifically, okay, what is the easiest definitions to put forward? So you can say, okay, a dress below the knee, for example, and that the arm should be covered at least below the elbow, and that and a woman who is married for sure will cover her hair. So those are the very simple criteria that I would say within the religious world are the easiest ones to go by. But we live in a more complex world than that. And one of the important poskim um, says that actually tzniut can be set by the norms of the standards of the social standards that we live in and the world that we live in as well. So it is true that in a world in which all women are wearing a certain dress, right? A code of dress, then it might be considered um, immodest in the sense that it's you're sticking out, you are different if you're doing something different. But if you're living in a world in which that has not been set as a standard, then why would the dress be different than pants in that sense, right? Why is it that we set it as such? So we can be respectful to someone because because that is the norms that they live. So maybe if I go to a religious community, I would want to make sure that I'm dressed accordingly. And I say I because it's about me no less than anyone else, according to make sure that I'm respectful to wherever I am. However, does that mean that that is what is modest for me? Not necessarily. So what is very clear for some rabbis that I was reading last night in preparation for the shiur, that a dress would be considered modest and pants not. I completely disagree because my teenage daughter says so to me. Right? She says, "What does that have to do with anything? That it has to do with the standards that one is living." So, and within that standard, you can have something which is modest and immodest. It really does not matter what you are wearing. So, I would say that within this, I think it's obvious to us that the questions or the questions which are more delicate or more difficult to pinpoint on are within a specific within specific boundaries. You could have people today who claim that nudist beaches are modest because that's what the norm is for everyone. I think within the spectrum of what we're talking about, that would not be a place where we go, right? That we're not going to say, well, that is actually because I'm not going to be judgmental about them, but that is sort of the point of them saying we go back to Adam and Eve before chapter 3 of Bereshit. And I'm sorry, but we're past chapter 3 right now, right? We're the Torah has set us in a place in which we don't we realize that the world that we live in is one in which we need to cover in order to be modest in a respectful way. This is the social norms of human beings that we live in, and this is throughout the world. But if you have an African tribe that they are used to dressing in one way, then perhaps it is modest for them. But if we're trying to copy that for ourselves and say, therefore, I can do this, I think I don't see it as being true and integral for us. So when you go to the extreme, I think it's clear. When you go to the opposite extreme, which is the picture that I showed you, unfortunately, there are just a few cults in Judaism today, which claim they are religious and are forcing women to dress similarly to what we saw in the picture at the beginning. But I say, just mind what I said, a few cults in all of Judaism today, and they are not accepted by anyone. So when you get to the extreme, then you realize, and unfortunately it has come out that some of these cults that were exiled, expelled from Israel, actually, they're in one of them is in South America now, and then was expelled from there. And then it's not surprising, at least to me, that you hear the sexual abuse of minors even within these cults, because it's extreme and it brings out the extreme as well. So from one extreme to the other, we live in the middle. And within the middle that we live, the most important is in terms of everything we saw at the beginning of this year, the first 40 minutes that I chose um, to go through a deep sense of what is and what is not modest. And then the second stage is, am I respectful to the norms of where I am? And then the third is, okay, what is tzniut for me, and what is tzniut within, considered the laws of tzniut within the community that I live, and that can also differ even between. I think there are different communities that we are in, and also within that, if you have a community that has been an Orthodox religious community for 250 years, then you can say, well, these are the norms that are here, right? And these are the norms that I see from those around me. So these are halachic norms that I see. Whereas if we are now being influenced from the outside, and then we're taking those norms and say, well, this is the norm, I still say at some level, yes, the norms of society do play in, as the Divrei Hamudot, this halachic opinion, says, but within a certain spectrum. So I think that if you have more yeah, Lev Tahor, I see in the chat, is an example of one of these cults, for example. You can see some crazy documentaries about them if you're interested. The name is Lev Tahor. But I think that you understand that I'm being a bit careful in the criteria and the guidelines as well. And the reason that I'm doing this is also out of tzniut. I don't think that it would be the right thing to have, it wouldn't be tzanu, at least for me, to now discuss more than we have. But when you have specific questions, then I think it's the right thing, especially for a man to approach the rabbi and for a woman to approach the rabbanit. This is intimate in the way that it should be, at least in my opinion. And definitely the discussion about tzniut in a group manner like we have here is something which is, we can discuss the philosophy and understanding and the deep of what tzniut is. And then when we get to the practical, I think it's more personal and therefore not something that we would discuss in such a form. So I know we're past our time, but we did start only 54 minutes ago to actually start the shiur. And thank you for your patience. If any of you have any questions, you're very welcome, or any reflections, you're very welcome.
May I ask this, that I have accepted, because I'm a divorced woman, I have accepted to cover my hair, and then I'm having a skirt, and it's nearly up to the knees. And when I'm working in the daycare, and many people are thinking that I'm a Muslim, and then I come into that difficult dilemma that okay, I don't want to too much show that I'm converting to Judaism, but then I have to say that I'm not a Muslim. Then they ask, who are you? So in a way, but I don't want to use my code because I feel like I have this line with Hashem, so I have to respect Hashem. That's why I'm like this, not because of anything. Because in the end, I have to be. I'm answered with Hashem. Though, how did you live your life with? So I don't care what the other people say about my dressing. and sometimes the dressing is helping the woman to be tzniut. But could you give me some advice? How should I respond to my colleagues at work?
Okay. Thank you very much for the question. First of all, just halachically, as a divorced woman, there are questions regarding the covering of the hair, which you can ask your rabbi, because it's the example given in the Torah is different than that, and that also depends on the norms, but that is just a technical thing. But I think that, and please ask your Rav or your Rabbanit about this. Secondly, I agree fully. In other words, if you want to share what and why you are doing something and you do so proudly, then that's a great thing. But if not, then who dares to impose on you that you have to share that with anyone? That you're a Muslim, that you're Jewish? Why do you have to share if it's not coming out of a good place? I mean, we live in liberal countries that allow women especially to do as they want, right? So we're not living, you don't have to justify anything that you're doing to anyone except Hashem for sure. And that, as you said very, very well. Um, but at a very personal level, I think just to share, this is how I feel comfortable with myself, and this is what I feel good about is a true answer for them. If anyone is interested beyond that and has a deeper connection to you, and you want to share the process that you're going through, then that is something different. But I don't think we owe anyone anything in terms of why we are dressing in a certain way for sure. And it's become an over focus within the Nordic countries. When you talk about women in general and in dress, I'm very surprised at the reactions on all ends because if a woman decides to wear a hijab, for example, who are you to even decide for them whether someone is imposing on them, whether they're wearing it for what reason? You would never do that same thing about anyone else on the other end of the spectrum, right? Is someone being imposed to not wear or to wear a certain code of dress when they're going to the beach or wearing a bikini because maybe the liberal world is imposing upon them to do so? You would never dare to do so. And if anyone did, then that they would, what that the reactions would be. So there is a general sense, I think, of, in my mind, something which is which we should stand up against in all senses in our society to say it's none of your business actually. To even think that or that someone is imposing upon me. I'm a free person and I choose as I want. Um, and I think it's we shouldn't accept the norms that the society has set for us, and this especially towards women. It's actually the opposite of liberal to have these discussions, in my opinion. Rebecca, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I got a look. I don't know who shared this, but I got a bit confused. As I understand it, if you as a non-Jew have already been married and you're divorced, you're not supposed to cover your hair because it's only a mitzvah that you take on as a Jewish woman. So basically, if you're a Jewish woman married to a Jewish man, then you should keep that mitzvah covering your hair. So even if you divorce that Jewish man, you should still continue covering your hair. But as a non-Jew who's becoming a Jewish person, if you've been married in your previous existence with a non-Jew, you're not supposed to cover your hair. That's how I understand it. So, but I don't know. That's maybe something she can discuss with her rabbi.
Definitely, that's what I said. There's different. I agree with the basic notion that you brought forward, but also I would take it further in that there are certain societies in which a divorced woman will uncover her hair because her status is that she is not married, and that is also something that allows her to get married. You see a woman and you see her status is unmarried, so. In my community, for example, that is in Israel, that is the case that we have some divorced women and religious, and they don't cover their hair out of halacha, not out of disregard of halacha. But it may not be that way in all communities. So therefore, as I said, these are it's personal. If it's a personal question, you should bring it up for sure with your Rav or Rabbanit. Sarah, please.
Yeah, so I was wondering about the cold bath houses, because there people are naked, but usually you're with your own gender, right? So is there a difference if you're naked with your own gender or like mixed in terms of modesty and Judaism?
Yeah, very good question. Um, First of all, I felt a bit abused because I went to a separate sauna and then there was a woman who was handling or whatever, doing the cleaning or whatever, and I just felt that was not okay because and it's, in other words, you have a trust in something, right? That it's considered separate in that sense. I think it goes back to the source that we saw in terms of modesty in the bathroom. In terms of what is modesty, if that is a social norm, then that is a norm, and one can be modest in such a situation or immodest in such a situation, right? One something can be considered a spa and health, and something can be considered sexual. The same way that a massage can be, right, in different ways. So in this we have this I think similar in a sense in which within this Hasidic spiritual circles in which men are going to the mikveh, for example, for spiritual before Shabbat as a normal thing. It's not considered in any sense immodest in that sense. But it really depends on the situation that you're in. So it goes even within such a situation. I would say it really depends on how people are acting, how you are acting, but it could be acceptable for sure. If you ask me, I'm not sure if you ask everyone, you'll get that response. But and for everything that we have said, really brings that forward. I think it's a good example of taking it to the extreme, but you're within your own gender, and this is what is the social norm, and that can be even modest in a sense and be acceptable, and I would say even important in terms of in terms of just being healthy in the relation to the body, because we're very influenced in terms of the body or sexuality as being sinful, and Judaism sees that as the opposite, as intimacy being godly, that it's bringing forward beauty and holiness. And how do you manage to that delicate line between everything that we have spoken about, especially the last part about halachot, which are external, to what is internal? And how do we relate that intimate relations are the most beautiful thing, and at the same time we're saying, wait, but anything of that externally is not okay. So when you have opportunities, I think, in which you can actually express that in a modest way, I think in my opinion, it's a positive thing.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. Isaiah.
Yeah, I will say something very fast about the lady. I think she's from Finland, Esther. The lady who spoke about being questioning and they care about her covering her head and things like that. You were a bit surprised, but you have to understand one thing. Finland joined the Nordic countries, but Finland is not Scandinavian. And the mindset here, even it says it's liberal, but I understand what Esther said, because in Finland, you get very often questioned about so many things. Finland is not like Scandinavia. Scandinavians are more open and they don't really mind what you're doing, what you're saying. In Finland, you get questioned mainly about your private life, about so many things. Sometimes you can feel even abused by so many private questions. So just to clear you what Esther meant, it actually happens in Finland in our daily basis. It's a bit sad. It's very strange because it's supposed to be more liberal according to the to the advertisement of the country and things like that. But Finland is a little bit different from Scandinavia. So just to let you know that it's not something that happens only to her. It happens in Finland. You get questioned very often. And the other question, actually, it was the same question that Sarah already had. So I'm clear. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I think that the world is definitely trying to find the balance on these things, and it's not an easy one. And that, in a sense, I hear what you say about Finland. I'm less familiar with Finland. I think within the Scandinavian countries, for sure, you had a push towards liberalism and liberalism of sexuality, and then it can bring forward interesting reflections. Okay, if we take away all of the social, you know, social standards and everything is okay, where do you end up? Do you end up with something which is more natural? Do you end up with a more positive? Do you end up with less abuse? Do you end up with a true sense of freedom? I think these are interesting philosophical questions. The Jewish approach that we have seen today is a bit the opposite. That what the over focus is what happens inside of myself, and in terms of the inner modesty, which has to do with much of, how I act towards myself, from the bathroom to how I approach other people, how I deal with other people, how I speak to other people, and from within. Once I have that of kvod bat melech pnimo, once I have the sense of the inner world being whole, then I can approach the question of, okay, now that I have it in the sense, how do I then, what implications does that have within the external world that I live in? I think some of the countries have taken the opposite approach, and it could be interesting to compare where we have ended up, at least in 2024 on this, and whether it could be interesting to have that discussion. Esther, you have your hand up again?
Yes, just thank you for the comment from the other lady. And yes, it's true, people ask very personal questions, but the Muslims are not asked so much because people assume they are Muslims. But I look a little bit different, so they are not quite sure. But the second thing is this, that I don't know if it's in Sweden and Norway and Denmark, do you have sauna? But in Finland, we have a lot of this sauna issue. And the halacha says that we are not allowed to see our parents naked. And when I was a kid, then under 5, we were all mother, father, and all the kids, we were naked in the sauna. But when we grew up, then only mother and the girls could be together, and father and my brother could be going to sauna separate. But when I came to this Judaism, I understood I should not even see my parents naked at all. So when Corona came, and I also don't like to go to swim at all anymore, because not only Corona, but because I don't want even other women to see me naked. I definitely don't want to see them naked. It's something, I don't like it. I don't know how other people, but I feel disgusting.
I just want to keep first of all, we're going to finish this shoe, and also I don't want to get into things that could take us into also things that could be considered not tzanor within the shiur. But I do think that what you said is correct, that out of the special respect that we're commanded from the Torah towards our parents, then that is there is a difference between children, or young children for sure, in which and older children, out of deep respect. One should, in the same sense that one would, it's the same for the parents and for others that we respect, such as rabbis or rabbanit. It's not the fact that you have a deeper sense of respect for them leads to the fact that you should distance yourself from such a situation for sure. I think, but there are different norms within families as well. But this is a halacha actually in terms of parents, and I thank you for bringing it forward, because when you say, "Wait, I have such deep respect for them," but then the other side could be, "Wait, but we want to have normalcy." And then, so it goes back to this ping pong that we've gone through this entire shiur. But this shiur has been much longer than usual because of the technicalities at the beginning. But now, even with that excuse, we're beyond our time. So I'm going to finish here. I hope that the shiur was helpful to you, even though I stayed a bit away from the guidelines and tried to go a bit deeper into the sense, but also just to remember that what could be right for me, also we have the social world that we live in, and especially the respect that I can have towards others. It doesn't mean that I'm not true to myself if I am respecting others and the norms. If I'm visiting another community, if I'm visiting, it's always good to ask. Trust, you're going to visit a religious community in Israel. What are the norms there, or what another religious community in Europe? Okay, so maybe in your community, your rabbi has told you this is okay according to our norms, and it's considered it's a tzeniut, and that's okay. Okay, but then what is what would be the case when I'm visiting, or how can I make sure that I'm respecting is for sure part of the overall halachot in this as well. So I thank you and wish you all Shavua Tov.
Shavua
Tov.
Shavua Tov.
Thank you for your technical getting us out of this mess.
בסדר.